What if the very concept of productivity is itself counterproductive? I'm Ray Myers. Welcome to Craft versus Cruft and to the year of our Wozniak 2023. I would like to talk about a topic inspired by the stories of Twitter layoffs a few months ago. You had rumors of people printing out all of the code that they had been working on, and presumably people would be judged to keep their jobs by how high the stack was. It was hearkening back to the days of lines of code used as a productivity metric, but we don't really know of all the decision making that was done there. But right or wrong, let's get outside of the rather unorthodox logistics that are present during a mass layoff, should you be unfortunate enough to ever have to carry one out, and let's just look at day to day. How do we reason about productivity? In the past, I've often said you can't measure productivity, but today I'll go so far as to say I was wrong. You can measure it, kind of. However, historically, most attempts to measure productivity have been so problematic that you would have been arguably better off doing nothing at all, just treating it as immeasurable. It's done more harm than good. So buckle up, because before we can talk about how this might go right, we've got to look at all the ways that it can go wrong. To measure something, we first have to define it. That's where the trouble begins. What is productivity? Suppose we reasonably say that productivity is the rate at which valuable work gets done. So that sounds simple enough. What is work? What is value? What is done? These may sound like needlessly pedantic points, but each one of these can be a source of issue. Let's start with arguably the simplest. What's done? Did it actually ship to users? Or did it just get handed off to the next link in the chain? This is a pitfall in productivity metrics because it's easy to measure the utilization of individual steps in a process and assume that optimizing them is equivalent to optimizing the entire system. It is not. In fact, it can make things worse. It teaches people to say, it's not my problem once something is off their plate, because their metrics will reward them for starting something new rather than helping where the blockers really are. So what is valuable? Ellie Goldratt said, productivity is meaningless unless you know what your goal is. I've seen projects with hundreds of tickets marked done before any of them went live. What's our level of confidence that those were valuable, that they met the goal? It would have to be quite low. Multi-year, multi-team efforts fail because the true criteria for success wasn't understood or couldn't be verified with a regular feedback loop. I've seen this happen. The results of it are devastating. If work got done but ultimately doesn't meet the needs, or was of low quality, or breaks frequently, or couldn't accommodate foreseeable changes in the future, then it is low value work. But many so-called productivity metrics will show positive numbers all the same. What even is work? What types of work are we considering valuable or worth counting? People tend to only think of the act of writing new code. What about maintenance? That is the vast majority of the total cost of ownership. Or fixing bugs, is that valuable? Documentation, is design valuable? Is mentorship valuable? Is peer review valuable? Or testing, or refactoring, or investigating some production anomaly, performing security upgrades or migrations? As you may have guessed, a typical attempt to count stories or feature points or what have you is going to miss a ton of this. But the problem is not just that the metrics are incomplete, it's that they can be actively harmful. That's because we're probably not measuring them for the heck of it. Businesses measure these things because they want to drive some kind of improvement. That means that tacit or explicit incentives will encourage getting the numbers up, getting your numbers up. The most obvious way to do that will always be to neglect whatever work isn't being counted. So despite good intentions, you may set up a situation where the only apparent way to get promoted is to sacrifice the future of the code base. As Richard Hamming said, you get what you measure, and as Deming said, a bad system will beat a good person every time. Does this seem far-fetched? Something that you or I would never fall for? I can show you that even a company like Google, the very inventors of site reliability engineering, even they are not immune to such destructive incentives. For some years, it's been a running joke how many products and features Google has retired over the years. See killedbygoogle.com. After the recent retirement of Stadia, Peter Yang peeled back the curtain on this a little bit and has revealed that internally at Google, there was something they jokingly referred to as the LPA cycle, the launch, promo, abandon cycle. In other words, you maximize your career growth by getting something new out of the door, getting promoted from the recognition, and then immediately moving on to something else because there is no more juice to be milked from that accomplishment. Now, I don't have firsthand knowledge. This is something of an anecdote, but it does reflect a very common pattern in the software industry. And you could even see that this kind of emergent behavior is not just an aspect of the software industry, but in all aspects of our society. In the excellent book, The Innovation Delusion, How Our Obsession with the New Has Disrupted the Work That Matters Most. I'll link to that in the description. And just in case the definitions of done and valuable work were not enough to thoroughly confuse matters, as Columbo would say, one more thing. Let's look at that sentence one more time. The rate at which valuable work gets done. We're using an ambiguous passive voice here. Gets done. Gets done by whom? The classic mistake is to map productivity metrics onto individual developers. If you've watched episode 2, Software Engineering is Social, you already know that this is a team sport. Skill disparities do, of course, exist, but productivity is better understood as a property of the team, not the individual. A team is an interdependent socio-technical system. Hyper-focus on individual output will ultimately slow down the system. Behaviors that elevate the team, such as mentorship or fixing shared problems, are often contrary to maximizing the perceived individual output. Imagine a basketball team where every player was only being measured on the points they score on their own. They would function terribly. They would get demolished by teams that are measured the way we do, which include metrics like assists that capture the overall contribution to the team's success as a unit. Members of a high-performing team are able to help each other get better without fear that it will detract from their own individual reward. Consider further that the context that enables productivity is not merely the team, but includes interactions between teams. This gets very hairy. So is it hopeless? Well, I wouldn't go that far. But you need to think critically about your unique situation. What is your goal? What factors are impeding your goal the most? Addressing those is what is important. Target your actual pain points. Don't just use some number out of the box. If you do choose to introduce metrics, which you may not need to do, then choose indicators intentionally in order to promote constructive behaviors with minimal side effects. Consider using tension metrics, metrics that will push against each other if one of them gets gamed in the wrong way. And we'll see an example of that in a second. In the context of software delivery, you may want to look at 3 of the DORA metrics. And those are deployment frequency, change failure rate, and lead time to change. 2 of those, at least, are in tension with each other, tension metrics, as I just said. Deployment frequency and change failure rate, right? Because if you deploy more frequently in a good way, you will get a safer system because the rhythm of delivery has become just more routine and rigorous. But if you do it in a bad way, your change failure rate is going to blow up. You're just pushing crap out faster. You don't want to do that. So that's an example where tension metrics prevent gaming the system in the wrong way. Another concept that's very important for high-performing teams is psychological safety. You can see Project Aristotle for some information on that. But of course, we don't just look at the results of one study. This is a consensus of the literature that psychological safety promotes high performance. That just happens to be a convenient example that is a very large study. Lastly, I can recommend looking at the SPACE framework by Dr. Nicole Forrest Green and others. She was also involved in the Dora DevOps report and the book Accelerate. So just the myth section alone of the SPACE framework article probably covers as much useful ground as any other article on developer productivity that I've ever seen. So at least skim that. These include myth, productivity is all about developer activity. Myth, productivity is only about individual performance. We talked about that a moment ago. And myth, one productivity metric can tell us everything. And then goes to outline the different categories that comprise the SPACE framework, one for each letter in SPACE. The S is for satisfaction and well-being. The P is for performance. The A is for activity. The C is for communication and collaboration. The E is for efficiency and flow. So I appreciate you for watching this far. Understand what your goal is. Understand what is holding you back. Manage those things. If you do decide that you need to introduce metrics, then do so intentionally in a way that is going to drive constructive behaviors. Regularly assess whether that's what's happening. And remember what Lao Tzu said in the Tao Te Ching, with patience, the most tangled cord may be undone. Thank you.